Hi, everyone. My name is Teresa. I'm one of the H2D2 coordinators. We're going to start shortly, but my understanding is that we're running late in pretty much all the other sessions that were happening. So I think we're going to give it at least 11:30, 3:35 to start, so everybody can finish their previous sessions.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
Okay, all right. I'll be back in 3 minutes to get this all started.
Perfect.
And just this is Andy. Can you hear me? I just want to make sure it's working.
Yep, you're good.
Hi, can you hear me? I'm Ruveyda.
Yes, hi, nice to meet you.
Meet you too.
Hi, everyone. My name is Teresa. I'm one of the H2D2 coordinators. We're starting a little bit later because some of the other sessions were running late, which is understandable since we're all learning this new technology. We're going to have a session chair, wonderful session chair, Alice Rotella, join us in a second and start. Alice, are you there?
I am. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Perfect.
I'd like to welcome you all. It's a beautiful sunny day in Ann Arbor, very unlike our usual winter weather, and it's sad that we can't all be here in person. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ezra Karger, who's going to talk to us about the long-run effects of public libraries on children using evidence from the early 1900s. Ezra?
Thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers for setting us all up remotely on such short notice. Today I'm going to be discussing how public libraries affect children. I'm going to focus on a historical, almost accident. And to get to that accident, I first want to introduce you to Andrew Carnegie. So Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland and immigrated to the United States at the age of 13 along with his family. His family was not particularly wealthy, so he almost immediately began work at a factory in southwestern Pennsylvania. And there was a resident in Allegheny who had a private library. And every Saturday, he opened up his private library to the local working boys. So Carnegie took advantage of this library and attributed much of his personal and professional success to the books that he read and his access to knowledge that he got from this private library. And so he decided that if he ever became wealthy, he was going to fund the construction of a large number of public libraries in the United States so that other, especially poor, children could take advantage of the important public library experience that he had had as a child. And this is exactly what Carnegie did. He spent over $37 million funding the construction of 1,600 public libraries in the United States between 1890 and 1921. By 1921, this represented about 30% of all of the public libraries in America. And I'm going to take all of his libraries, link them to census microdata from the early 1900s, and use a within-family design to measure the effects that these public libraries had on children. This is going to build on prior work from many economists, including a very important project by Martha Bailey, Brian Jacob, Michael Cavane, and William Sundstrom. They collected a lot of the library data that I'm going to use today in unpublished work from 2011. This is a map of all of Andrew Carnegie's funded public libraries, and you can see a tremendous concentration of his grants in the Midwest. In the Northeast, many cities and towns had pre-existing public libraries, and so very few towns applied for a Carnegie grant. The application process involved sending Andrew Carnegie a letter, and then he basically gave out a large grant to most of the towns that applied, conditional on them agreeing to provide the public library with a plot of land and a small amount of operating expenses every year to keep the public library open. In the South, cities and towns worried that Carnegie would force them to integrate their public libraries, although he did not. And so very few towns in the South applied for access to a Carnegie grant. And you can see that in the Midwest, in Indiana, Ohio, right near to where Carnegie grew up, many towns applied, many received grants, and then built a public library. And there's a lot of variation within a county or within a state in whether these Carnegie public libraries were built in the late 1800s or 1910 to 1920. So I'm going to use that variation in some of my specifications. The data I'm going to use can include complete count census microdata from 1900 through 1940. I'm going to use standard linking techniques from Abramitsky, Bustan, and Erickson, modified slightly to take advantage of the fact that I can see every adult in 1940 in multiple early census years. And I'm going to have a final sample of around 16 million adult males in 1940, who I've linked back to at least one early census record, where I can find places of residence, parental characteristics, and information about who their siblings were. I'm going to rely on adult males and not adult females because unfortunately the standard linking techniques do a very bad job of linking women across census years because of name changes post-marriage, although I'm trying to figure out ways to get at the effects on women as well. I'm then going to take this census microdata set of 16 million adult males in 1940, and I'm going to link their childhood locations to a data set consisting of all of the Carnegie libraries. This data was compiled by a library scientist named George Babinski in 1969, and he went through every single piece of correspondence that Andrew Carnegie received and sent, the court letters between the towns and Andrew Carnegie, and he standardized this information, put it in a table that he published in a book, and this data was then digitized in 2011 by Martha Bailey and her co-authors. I'm going to present regression specifications that look like the top line in this slide. We're going to have a set of outcomes, including years of educational attainment, logged annual wage income, and an indicator for whether each respondent had more than $50 of non-wage income. In the 1940 census, enumerators asked for the total amount of wage income that each respondent earned, and they also asked each respondent if they received more than $50 of non-wage income, but not the final amount. Wage income is money that you made from your boss, so you were more likely to have wage income if you worked in mining or factory work. Non-wage income was associated with more prestigious occupations like farm ownership, being a doctor or a lawyer, occupations that around 20% of adult males in 1940 earned a vast majority of their income from. I'm going to regress these outcomes on an indicator for whether each child lived in a town that received a Carnegie grant before the age of 5. I'm also going to in the paper that I'm happy to send to anyone who's interested, explore a continuous measure and get roughly the same results. I'm going to add as a set of controls fixed effects for each child's birth year, their birth state, their birth order, whether they're the first child or the second child in their household when I find them in the early census year, parental occupation, industry, and birthplace, and in some specifications, county by birth year fixed effects, neighborhood fixed effects, and household fixed effects. And I'm going to interact all of these controls with race and childhood census year. So to give you a sense of what my results look like, the outcome in this table is going to be years of educational attainment. And in the first column, I'm just going to regress years of educational attainment on that indicator for whether each child had access to a Carnegie grant before the age of 5. I'm going to include only birth year and birth state controls interacted with race and childhood census year. And we can see that there's a strong association between the children who had access to a Carnegie grant and final educational attainment in 1940. And I want to make a point here about the exposure variable. I'm using the grant date and not the construction date because we don't have a complete data set of when every Carnegie library opened, although in almost all cases, the Carnegie library opened 1 to 4 years after the grant was initially given. I'm going to rely on the grant year for that reason. In the second column, I'm going to add neighborhood fixed effects. And these neighborhoods are going to be defined at the enumeration district level. Enumerators in early censuses went around knocking on doors, and they had to collect all of the information for the respondents whose doors they knocked on within a few weeks after the census began collecting information. Because of that, enumeration districts are usually geographically constrained. In Chicago, there were many enumeration districts. They divided up the city into squares so that enumerators could go around in one predefined area and find all the people and ask them the relevant questions. In rural areas, they would be larger, but it would be still possible to get around and ask 1,000 people or 2,000 people these census questions in a short period of time. When I add these enumeration district fixed effects, the coefficient drops to 0.095. I'm then going to add county by birth year fixed effects, census page fixed effects, which again take advantage of the fact that enumerators went and knocked on doors and wrote down the answers in order. So census pages represent a very granular measure of geography. And I'm then in the last specification going to include household fixed effects. If we wanted to interpret, as I do, this last coefficient causally, access to a Carnegie grant before the age of 5 increased years of educational attainment by 0.1 years off a base of 8.9 years. And we can see that as I add these controls, I'm soaking up more and more of the variation in years of educational attainment. By the last column, these household fixed effects and county by birth year fixed effects are explaining around 3/4 of the variation in years of educational attainment. But this coefficient on access to a Carnegie grant doesn't really change from the second to the fifth model. So you might not be convinced by this causal explanation. I'm going to run a set of robustness checks that might be a bit more convincing or help you agree with me a little bit more about the causal effect here. One worry you might have is this is a time period when towns were also investing in other local institutions that likely affected children. In particular, Claudia Golden has a series of papers from the late 1990s showing that the expansion of public high schools across the United States was taking place at exactly this time. And so I want to control for this availability of public high schools and this time varying availability. And I construct a new data set of all of the high schools in the United States between 1850 and 1950 and when they entered, when they were founded. And I show that controlling for access to a public high school has no effect on the coefficients I presented in the previous slide. I also in the paper use a continuous measure of exposure, looking at the number of years during your childhood when you had access to this library instead of the discrete measure I presented. As a set of placebo tests, I'm first going to perturb each library grant date. I'm going to assume that the library grant was given 20 years earlier or 20 years later, and I'm going to look at the effect of these placebo library grants on educational attainment of children, and I find no effect. So it's not that these towns were continuously investing and younger children were always better off in these towns than their older siblings. It's that at the time that the Carnegie grant was given, we see a sharp increase in educational attainment for younger children relative to the older children in their households. Lastly, I'm going to collect data on the founding dates of college and university libraries. And in the paper, I show that when these 1,000 college and university libraries entered a town, children didn't really have access, as you might expect, and these had no effect on the educational attainment of children. So I've hopefully convinced you that libraries increase educational attainment. I want to look at some other outcomes. In the first column, I present logged annual wage income, where I treat zeros and levels as zeros and logs. And we can see that access to a Carnegie grant before the age of 5 in my within household specification increases logged annual wage income by 2 log points very noisily. So it either had small or null effects on wage income. In the second column, I present the non-wage income result. And you can see that access to a Carnegie grant before the age of 5 increased the probability that you reported having more than $50 of non-wage income by 1 percentage point off of a base of 32%. And that's pretty precisely estimated. And in the last column, I show that access to a Carnegie grant increased occupational prestige. This is based on a survey done in the 1960s asking respondents which occupations were more preferable. And the scale is hard to understand. It has a mean of 34, a standard deviation of roughly 12, but we see that access to a Carnegie grant has precise positive effects, even though they're small, on occupational prestige. So these results are somewhat reminiscent of a wonderful paper from 2014 by Mel Steffens and Duyang Yang. And they look at the effect of compulsory schooling laws on adult outcomes of children who were exposed to these compulsory schooling laws. And I'm going to show that the compulsory schooling laws had very similar effects to these library results. And in particular, each of these 4 specifications is going to be a different outcome, and it's going to measure the two-stage least squares effect of a year of educational attainment on the outcome represented by the column, instrumenting for years of education with these state-level compulsory schooling laws. And in the first column, I replicate the Steffens and Yang result. And they showed that an additional year of educational attainment had null or maybe even slightly negative effects on weekly wage income among respondents who reported having some wage income. In the second column, I extend their results and I look at annual logged wage income, where I treat zeros as zeros in log terms. And here we see that an additional year of educational attainment reduced wage income by 24 log points, which is a huge negative effect. In the third column, I show that this is explained because people were shifting into non-wage income. Access to compulsory schooling laws, being forced to go to school, increased years of educational attainment, which caused a 5 percentage point increase in the probability that you reported a significant amount of non-wage income from a baseline of around 34%. And in the fourth column, I show that occupational prestige increased in response to these compulsory schooling laws. So these results are very similar to the library results.
Okay, can I break in for just a minute, Ezra? This is Elise.
Of course.
And Teresa. Right, I now have a picture of Ezra on my screen, but not his slides. Is that affect? Are other people in the same boat?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The same.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that fixable, or should we just go on?
Yeah, let me reshare and see if that works.
Yeah. And you can go on, Alice, and ask the question in the Q&A if you want.
Can you see my slides?
Yes, we're good.
Okay,
Awesome.
we're good. Yeah,
So-
I'll come back with that question a little later. And you have another, say 3 minutes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Oh.
So did you
sorry.
lose me at, I'll finish up. Yeah, but did you lose
Okay.
me at the conclusion?
Yeah. Awesome.
Let me just conclude. So both public library grants and compulsory schooling laws increased educational attainment, non-wage income, and occupational prestige. And they either had null or negative effects on wage income. And in the paper, I go into this in more detail, but I show that both Carnegie's library grants, the public libraries that he funded, and compulsory schooling laws shifted children into different occupations. So they moved children from manual labor, mining, and factory work into more prestigious occupations like white-collar professional jobs and farm ownership. And I think this tells us something interesting, which is when we analyze these human capital interventions from the early 1900s, an important effect was an occupational choice, not just wage income as we normally measure it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Ezra. You have one question right now. I'm not sure if you can see it, but I'm going to read it. It's a question that says, how about the heterogeneous effects on children from different population groups, and lists family income, gender, race, ethnicity, etc.?
Definitely. So I've done some analysis of heterogeneity, although I'm still working on it. And let me tell you some very preliminary results. I don't have enough power to separate out the effects of public libraries on children for Black children and white children separately, because most Black children at the time lived in the southern United States, and those are areas that received very few public libraries funded by Andrew Carnegie. In terms of family income, if you split the sample by parental occupational score, because we don't know their exact income, I see no large differences in the treatment effect of public libraries on children for children who grew up in high SES or low SES families. And this could just be a power issue. I don't want to trust the results too much, but we do see different baseline levels of educational attainment for children who grew up in high SES or low SES families. It's just Carnegie grants increased educational attainment by roughly the same amount, 0.1 years for each group. And in terms of gender, unfortunately, I'm not presently able to tell you about the effects on women because the strategy I'm using for matching, it doesn't work very well when we're linking women back to earlier census years, which is something that I hope to explore in the future.
Okay, I don't see another question on the list, so I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair to ask a question of you. And part of this is informed by a paper that I had a chance to hear last year by Berkus and Denka that argues that Carnegie libraries affected the degree of patenting. And I know you're familiar with that work. But when I heard that paper and I hear yours, one worries about selection, the systematic differences between the places that applied for, were successful at getting a Carnegie thing. You do a fair amount of talking about this. You say that New England places already had these things. Southern states didn't want Blacks and whites to go together. So you pay attention to that and you try to get a handle on this by putting in this information about high schools. But I continue to be worried about this, and I would have liked to have seen a little bit more description, for example, of was it poor places that tried to get these things in order to make up for the fact that they were poor because the rich places already had public libraries, or was it rich places that were already investing in a whole bunch of things that were more likely to go after the Carnegie libraries? I mean, I'm just worried about all these selection issues, and I know you are too.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I love Peter and Enrico's paper, and I'm working with Peter on a project about modern libraries. They have a great identification strategy because patents are a point in time. They can compare places that received Carnegie grants and places that were offered a Carnegie grant but rejected it. And they have enough power there to measure the effects on patenting rates and show that there are sharp positive increases of the libraries. I'm also very worried about selection. And so I think my placebo tests made me a little happier about the selection question. The similarity to the compulsory schooling laws, I also found very convincing because that uses a completely different sample of children. So it would be strange if these selection effects were driving educational attainment, non-wage income, and occupational prestige effects in both settings, I think. And I also do try to use these college and university libraries as a way to argue that the Carnegie libraries were different. I think your geographic point is very important, which is places in the South weren't really applying, neither were places in the Northeast. But the places that were applying in the South and the Northeast may have been different. And so I, at some point, focused just on the white male children in the Midwest, where there was more homogeneity in places that received libraries, perhaps, and in the types of places that applied. And there I find identical effects. And that's where most of the variation is coming from. But selection is definitely something I'd like to be thinking about. Thanks.
Okay. I find that convincing. Okay, I'm going to push us along to thank you very much, Ezra, for a very interesting paper. Look for more of them. We'll pass this on to Andrew Garin from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign on the question of the arsenal of democracy, whether it was an engine of mobility.
Great.
Andrew, it's you.
Great.
Somehow I have both you. There we got it.
Okay, let me start sharing. Wait, can you guys see my slides?
I can't.
You can't.
No.
Okay. So let me, okay, share screen. Entire screen. There we go. Okay.
There you go.
Okay, you can probably see everything. Are we good?
Well, back down. There you go.
Do you guys see a full screen of slides now?
I do, and I see you on the bottom.
Perfect.
A
Okay,
lovely
so,
combination.
okay, please interrupt if it's for some reason something goes wrong, but
Okay.
we're up and running. Thank you again for making this work in kind of strange circumstances. It's really nice to have some sort of virtual social interaction while we were all physically isolated. But I'm glad to be able to share this. So this project was the Arsenal of Democracy and Engine of Mobility, and it's joint work with Jonathan Rothbaum at the U.S. Census. And the starting point of this project is there's growing concern about the kind of vanishing manufacturing hubs in the middle of the country that were seen as providing a source of good jobs, good manufacturing jobs that were an important source of upward mobility for people without kind of college degrees or without coming from privileged families. And there's been a lot of discussion about what's gone wrong since the 1960s, that led these jobs that were so important in the 40s, 50s, and 60s to fade away. But another perspective is that the 40s, 50s, and 60s in the mid-century were kind of a unique period. And a lot of these good jobs in manufacturing hubs didn't exist, if you go back before the 1920s. And one of the prominent theories is that World War II had a direct impact on the manufacturing expansion and the kind of good jobs of the post-war that followed. And while there's a consensus view, there are many channels this could operate through. And for the most part, we only have time series evidence pointing to this. There hasn't been a lot of micro-level evidence that ties a clear story by which World War II would have directly raised these sorts of manufacturing opportunities and increased work opportunities for people in specific places. And so what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to focus on the spending investment channel, look at the massive industrial mobilization effort that occurred during World War II, and we're going to think about the implications of that for labor markets in the post-war and the rest of the 20th century. And so we're going to be looking specifically at these massive government-funded industrial plants that were built to support the war supply effort, both on local labor markets to get a sense of whether or not manufacturing work opportunity expanded in the long run in places that had these investments made in them, and that's going to be a kind of county level difference in differences. And then the second piece is to ask, was this just, are we just studying effects on places, or did being in a place that has manufacturing work opportunity in the mid-century have personal effects on the ability to increase your own earnings rank and personal outcomes? The question here is the exposure of people in the middle of the country to these good manufacturing jobs, was that causally related to upward mobility? What we're not going to be able to say in a macro sense is whether or not, when we take it all together, this led to a kind of overall macro Great Compression, but we do want to understand whether or not that sort of kind of local exposure to good manufacturing jobs was important for people in their career trajectories. And just to preview, because I don't have a lot of time, is we're going to find that the places that had these publicly financed plants really looked like they had kind of causal effects on the side, drastic effects on the size of their manufacturing sectors, both in terms of the number of jobs and the amount that those jobs paid on average. And we have results that suggest that this is really because there was a one-time dump of a factory that was then sold off after the war to a private company that wouldn't have located it there otherwise, and then was using it for civilian goods. We can look separately at the plants that were less likely to be converted back to civilian production and show that it's really not just that there was Cold War military spending being dumped into these places after the war. It's really this one-time intervention. But kind of more strikingly is that when we look at kids born in the places that these plants opened who were born before the war, they had higher earnings as late as the 1980s, and people, particularly for people born in the lower half of the income distribution, we find notable effects on upwards earnings mobility in adult life. So I'm gonna, there's literature on this. that I don't really have time to go through. I'm happy to discuss in more depth, but there isn't, the challenge to studying these sorts of policies is that it's hard to find exogenous shocks to regions. And World War II, I'm going to argue, kind of provides us a good source, the largest source of plausibly random variation across places. And the other contributions in this World War II literature, there just isn't a lot of strong evidence showing that World War II expenditures had causal effects in the long run. And so focusing on these plants, we're going to see that it kind of makes a difference. So let me just do a quick background on this, on the expansion. So in a matter of 3 years, Pearl Harbor was in 1941. And by 1942, the U.S. had managed to triple manufacturing output over what it had been 3 years earlier. So this was massive expansion in output. All the production was done by private firms under contract, but there was not enough productive facilities in the United States to just go ahead and do it at existing facilities. So the first thing that the U.S. government did is it gave very generous subsidies to firms that needed to create new industrial plant facilities to meet their contracts. But then for some of the very large contracts, that wasn't enough, is that they needed very large facilities. And this is kind of representative of what you're seeing today right now, is that companies are very wary to go start mass producing ventilators for what could be a 1 year crisis. No one's going to invest in that right now because they're worried about the return. And that was true of building kind of a massive B-39 or B-29 bomber plant in 1941. And so over the course of 1 year, they had to expand production to meet targets. They had to create a series of very large plants that companies weren't willing to invest in. And so the government took the lead on that. They contracted with firms to build and operate them, but the military and the defense apparatus had a kind of direct role in figuring out where and how these plants would be built. And the key here is that they were building, so we're thinking about, this is essentially like the amount of investment in 200 or 300 plants is going to be about 10% of the value of the existing manufacturing capital stock that was present. So this is massive expansion. And they had to get it done by 1942 was the goal. And so they scrambled to find whatever opportunities they could to get facilities that were kind of met 3 criteria, which is that they had to be proximate to basic resources that you need to run a plant. They had to be built extremely rapidly, and they needed to be secure. And this is the key thing, is that most manufacturing companies wanted to, if they were going to invest in places where they saw growth. And that is in contrast to what the federal government wanted during the war effort, which is that they were worried that a blackout would shut out a manufacturing hub, or that an attack could totally disrupt the supply chain. So what the government and the military wanted was to build these places in fairly obscure towns that had reserve labor that wouldn't be attractive for manufacturing otherwise. And so if you read kind of contemporary histories kind of at the end of the war in the 1940s and 1950s, one kind of theme that comes up is that the industrial, so this is a direct quote, is that the industrialist reluctance to invent and disperse plant facilities was at odds with what the government wanted. And as a result, the government could only build these plants if they were willing to put up the money. And so the result is, for a subset of plants, the government, through the Defense Plant Corporation and other government vehicles, fully financed some of these plants. They paid for and owned them. At the end of the war, they sold them off. And just to give you a quick example, though I'm sure on time, just because this is a Michigan-based talk, is, the biggest example was Willow Run, which was built in Ypsilanti. It dominates Ypsilanti if you've ever been there. It was built in a matter of a year, and it was built there because Henry Ford had a kind of boys' camp on a large kind of plot of land to be kind of this rural getaway camp. And when they started reaching out to say, where can we get an airfield-sized plant, a plant with an airfield to build something, he said, if it's for the war emergency, I have this huge plot of land that you could use. And so, this is what it looks like when it was built. And this is what Ypsilanti looks like today. You can see Willow Run dominates the right half of the map. But the important thing is that Ford didn't do this in its own interest. In fact, at the end of the war, Ford declined to repurchase it, and it was bought by its competitor eventually 10 years later. And it was operated through 2010. So that's a set. That's just to give one example of the sorts of plants that we should have in mind. Okay, so the research design this is going to motivate is we're going to look at these plants that were specifically the ones that were financed by the government and not by firms' own funds. And the idea here is that the siting of these plants were driven by short-term war-motivated concerns that would not have driven plant siting in any other times. What we want to look at here is two counties that are both kind of smaller cities that, in the absence of a war, neither of these places would have gotten private investment. But because of the war, one of them, because there happened to be land available or the right kind of mix of circumstances, had a plant sited for this kind of defense emergency. And that's the comparison we want. And the argument that we're going to make is that ultimately this is going to create as good as random variation, but in the baseline variation, we'll relax that to at least parallel trends. But I'll show that we're not able to use that parallel trends assumption when we start looking at long run. So how we're able to study this is that there are comprehensive books of data that document every investment that was made. So we digitized these. I know people have used similar data in recent research as well. But it splits down. If you look on the right-hand side, we can actually see the expenditure on plants based on whether or not it was privately financed or publicly financed. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use that microdata to identify most investment was concentrated in these large plants. And so we're going to look at new large plants that were new, that were large, which is most of the expenditure, and where the structures, the physical structures that couldn't be moved, were basically entirely built by the public government, saying that private companies had no willingness to invest in them. So there's 202 counties that have any such plants. We're going to study this two ways. One is to kind of say how much spending on this stuff was there per capita, even though it's a kind of sparse measure. But I think to get a more striking look at this, it's useful to look at the places where the spending per capita was highest and call that a binary treatment so that we can actually think about a kind of propensity for reweighting estimate where we can have a clear control group. So what we're going to do here is look at the top half of the kind of most intensively treated counties. So that's 101 out of the 202, drop the next 101, and then create a control group out of similar looking places here. And we're going to do the county level data is going to start coming from this Haynes ICPSR series. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a propensity score reweighting estimate. And we'll also look at OLS differences and differences. And we're going to use basic observables about county size and basic kind of workforce composition that reflect those basic characteristics that counties need to have any manufacturing, to kind of rule out places that are kind of very rural and remote. And we're going to only condition on 1930 economic observables so then we can look at 1920 through 1940 pre. So just to give you a sense, these black counties are the ones that got these plants, and then the darker red places are the ones that are putting more control weight on this propensity score reading. So if you look at the top left, we're comparing Spokane with Olympia. Or in Michigan here, we're comparing Ypsilanti with Lansing. So first, let me go through the results on places, and I'll talk about the effects on people. So the first set of results is that there's large, persistent level effects on manufacturing production, employment, and average wages. This is the treatment control propensity score reweighted effect on manufacturing output in value-added terms. And in logs, you can see that there's an increase in output by about 30 to 40% that kind of impressively persists as late as 2010, which is the kind of latest data point here. And you can look at what that meant for total payroll, which was about proportional, and you can split payroll into an employment effect, which is very large early on, but fades out a little bit by the 1980s, and a wage effect. So this is, of the people who have manufacturing jobs, they're getting paid about 8 to 10% more than people in manufacturing jobs in other places. that are in the control group. And just a few notes about this is that there's basically no pre-trend in this graph. If I was to do this with private plants or plants that were privately financed, you would see a pre-trend. I can show you that really quickly. Here you can see that there is a pretty dramatic pre-trend between 1930 and 1940, which is in contrast to these publicly financed ones. The other thing is that I chose this mainly for illustrative purposes, the use of this propensity score reweighting estimator, very robust to other sets of conditioning variables, other estimators, or just using OLS or per capita spending OLS gives you very similar results. It's a mix of the intensive and treatment. It looks like it's the per capita spending that really matters, but the treatment gives you a pretty stark way of looking at it. Second, in terms of these. Yeah.
Andrew, you got 2 minutes left.
Okay, great. So places have permanent increases in population and employment, and you see spillover effects on other sectors like retail employment, no effects on retail wages, but to the extent that manufacturing jobs are more common, it affects total median family income. So let me just kind of partially, and then I'm not going to go through. If you have questions about this, I'm happy to talk about it. But we have evidence that this is not coming from continued spending in the post-war. It's coming from the plants that were really reconverted and sold off, where there was a one-time investment by the federal government. So some results on other drivers of persistence, which I don't have time to talk about. But I want to move to this question of people. Is that we see that these places expanded their manufacturing opportunities. What about people who lived there? Was this all just driven by people moving in who would have earned more anyways? Or were there actually effects on people, and do these opportunities to work actually provide upward mobility opportunities for local residents? So we're going to look using linked data at children who were born in these counties between 1928 and 1942, so they were born before the war in counties, but too young to serve. We're going to look at their long-run outcomes. And we can't do a differences here because we only have the post-period outcome data that we're going to use. And so there's two data sources we're going to use. One links the 1940 population census to 1970s tax returns based on PICs, and we're going to use that to create mobility tables based on parents' earnings ranks and kids' earnings ranks, and then we're going to use another data set that's the CPS and Social Security records linked to place of birth. And so the outcome here is your earnings ranking in the national distribution in the 1970s, average between 1975 and 1980. And what you can see here is that for people who were born to parents below the median income, there was a full rank, 1 percentile rank increase for people born in these plants, and less so for above median. And you can see that if we plot these effects by parents' earnings decile, they are there throughout the lower half of the earnings distribution and then fade out afterwards. So I'm about out of time. I think I am out of time. So I just want to point out that we can use this other data to kind of see how the effects play out over time, where you can see that we have our first earnings observation in 78, and they fade out only by the 90s. So this is saying people born in these treated counties had higher earnings as late as 40 years later. And so we can break down where that's coming from more. Happy to discuss that in detail, and happy to discuss questions of persistence, but I just wanted to get through those core results, and I'd welcome your questions. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Teresa?
Yes?
I thought I heard you I heard you saying something. Uh-oh, we're getting are we getting feedback? Yes.
Should I mute my
Teresa?
Yes? Hi?
Okay. Hi. All right. Things seem to be working okay now?
Yeah.
We were getting feedback for a while there. Okay, right now I don't have any questions that have been submitted. So again, I'm going to take my position here as chair to ask one. can you go out on a limb and say whether or not you think your findings have a result for the question of industrial policy? Given what you know, would you make a recommendation?
So here's the thing, is that you have to think about the intervention that was, are you looking at me or my slides now? Great. Okay, so I'll just speak with what I have now. That's the temptation, and it's important. It's actually, I feel like this week is the first time I've seen something that's a kind of relevant circumstance here. I mean, one of the things that was really unique about World War II is the fact that there was this need to build factories in the course of a year that made optimal use of the resources at hand, which meant that there were a lot of unskilled labor, people without formal training, the people who were left behind in the US while other people went off and served. And we need to figure out how to make as much as possible with those resources, and it was a matter of life or death, which led to a sort of investment that figured out how to make very productive use of people who may not have had a lot of formal training. And that was then a kind of mode of production that was put in place that kind of dominated. I mean, once those plants were built, that was what we figured out how to do for, that lasted decades. And so there's a sense in which you think there might be, it seems reasonable to think that there may be some sort of endogenous technical change or directed technical change that has persistent effects there. And the reason I bring this up is to say the fact that it boosted wages, and, there are other factors like unionization, because there was bargaining power of the people who were so needed in this period. That was really unique to that situation that kind of created, it's not just the expansion per se, but an expansion of production that made such good use of the people who were there, that placed so much weight on their work, really created these kind of long run effects on the ability of people of all backgrounds to get better earnings when these plants opened up. It's hard to say that, if you look at the $1 Million Plants papers today, when Nissan opens a plant in Tennessee, it's almost all robots. So it's hard to see that having the same effect. You can't just build any plant and expect to see this. I think it's really about the specific technologies they were putting in place. So if we start rushing today to get everybody who's healthy building ventilators, and instead of doing this robotized, because we don't have the time to figure out how to build the robots to build these ventilators, but actually have people using whatever tools they have on hand, and that kind of changes the norm for how we produce in the future, that could have an effect.
Other people can, of course, submit questions later to you. I want to thank you very much for a very interesting paper. I teach this stuff in my economic history course, and your findings are going to make you my way into to the next semester. So thank you very much, and we're going to go on to our next speaker. Okay, our next speaker is Ruveyda Gozen from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Take it away.
Can you see my slides?
Right now, I can just see your face.
Right now?
Teresa, can you help her?
Okay, sorry, I didn't share the screen. Okay, now you should be able to see.
Yes, looking good.
Good? Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Ezra and Andrew. They were really nice and interesting papers. So here's mine. So as the title suggests, I studied the relationship between property rights and innovation dynamism, and I try to come up with the historical evidence by using the female patents data in the United States. Okay. So we know that there is an enormous literature about the impact of institutions and property rights on economic growth and development. And I mean, as I wrote here, there are really canonical, really nice papers and books, and they basically show that better defined property rights or well-defined institutions do really promote economic development and growth. So just as their question, similar to theirs, my big picture question is, what are the effects of property rights on economic development? But as you see from the question and from the literature, the biggest challenge is actually a causal interpretation. There was a reverse causality issue, there are limited variables or endogeneity issues. So by using the plausibly exogenous policy adoption, I try to overcome that reverse causality issue as much as possible. And Just to narrow it down, my narrow question is, what is the causal effect of giving property rights to women on a number of patents they have in the 19th century in the United States? So one important thing is that like we're all studying like historical stuff, and it's important to note the policy implication. So because these things happened like hundreds of years ago, and still, for example, from my topic, we observed that in developing economies, they're really suffering from ill-defined institutions or poorly defined property rights. So if we can show, and if I can show that defining these rights in a better way or giving equal rights to women or to a minority group or to another group, if that increases innovations, which are actually seen as a channel, as a great channel for economic growth, then, and by using like the 19th century as a laboratory, then we can have a really nice policy implication even for today. Okay, so let me directly dive into my laboratory and variation. So basically, I look at the 19th century. In the first half of the 19th century, we basically observed that women may have no rights, except the one that in 1790, it is stated that with a law that everyone is allowed to apply for a patent, woman or a man, it doesn't matter. But the problem is, since they have no property rights, there is no actually private returns on applying for a patent. However, in the second half of the 19th century, they're given really nice rights, like equal rights in term, and these rights make them an economically independent actors in the economy. So basically, they're given the rights to control property, write contracts, and engage in business on their account, and keep their earnings from their labor. So I will exploit the policy adoption, and I will show you the state and time variation with a color map. But let me just motivate you a little bit more. So let's go back to archives. So here is one patent, and this patent is for a machine which actually still affects our lives, which is actually a dishwasher machine, and this is invented by a woman from Illinois. And we observe that even this patent, like this invention, becomes a part of Whirlpool Corporation, which we know today. And as we see from this example, that when you give economic rights to women, they can invent, like they can still invent even before these rights, they have this ability, but providing these secure property rights, increasing the private returns on having a patent, probably changes their environment and economic environment very much, and increases the opportunities even for the future, like creating a long-run income stream. And a second picture from archives is, so maybe you're worried that, like, do people really know about these policies, or do they really understand these policies? Because that's a huge norm change, and people might be a little bit reluctant, or they may not understand what's going on. So I looked at the archives, and basically this appears a few times, and they basically explain publicly to the public these rights, and then they basically discuss over these rights. So it's clear that at least on the newspapers, we observe that people are actually aware of these changes, these policies. But still, even if they're aware, maybe people in a rural area or people who maybe they do not get a newspaper, I mean, there might be other scenarios. So I will show you my event study. And basically, you will observe that the effect is, the policy effect is more impactful over time in the long run. So this could justify the idea that maybe people were a little bit confused at the beginning, and then the policy establishes more and shows its effect slowly and more over time. Okay, so here is my policy variation. So it's a nice time and state variation. And the darker colors represent later adoption of the policy. So I'm exploiting this policy variation, but the thing you will observe on this graph, on this map, is that there are some like regional correlations. Like South seems to pass the laws a bit later than Midwest. So then what I do is to at least like to see if these regional correlations somehow like contaminate my results, I basically add region by year fixed effects to my analysis, and I observe that the magnitude shrinks a little, but the impact is still significant and positive. Okay, So the data I'm using is, so I'm using data from 19th century. So like I have the information on women patentees, like name, surname, city, state, patenteer, and the patent information. And I had to work on this a lot because it was like from an old book, just as Andrew showed, like a book. So it was from an old book, so you have to like digitize that and, you know, create the Excel file so that you have a nice data. So it took a really long time to actually work on that. And finally I did it. And I use historical census data. So for this analysis, I'm doing the analysis at the state level. So I'm also merging it with the historical census data, and the policy data is obtained from Tennyson et al. From 2012. Okay, so here is just a descriptive picture how the number of patents change over time. So we observe that even if it seems like it's zero in the like in 1850s or 60s, they're not actually zero, but probably kind of pushed a little because of the higher numbers like over time. And so we observe that there's actually a really nice, huge increase of the number of patents obtained by women. And also you can see the number of collaborated patents, which is which is the blue dashed line. So it basically shows that, I mean, it's not a huge number, like it's around 200 or 300 as far as I remember. And it seems like there is also a little increase in the number of collaborated patents too. But this is a really nice increase and showing the number of patents obtained by women. So here's my empirical strategy. So basically this is kind of like a diff and diff framework. So I basically, I basically add state fixed effects, time fixed effects, and policy and dummy. And as control variables, I basically add the literacy rate, labor force participation, and their interaction. So one issue that I want to note here is that the baseline regression is actually policy plus the state fixed effects and time fixed effects. So if you observe, when you look at these control variables, they're actually endogenous because they can affect the policy state and the policy adoption year, and policy adoption year can also affect the literacy rate and labor force participation. So these days I'm working on, instead of using the contemporaneous values of these variables, I'm going to use two methods. One is to take the lags of them, but still there might be some endogeneity left. So the best method is to use the baseline value of these variables. So that's something I'm working on. But for today, I'm just going to show you the results with the contemporaneous variables. All right. So here is the main, the main result of my paper. So basically, and I forgot to explain that the dependent variable, it's the patents, but not the number of patents. It's basically inverse hyperbolic transformed number of patents. This is because basically there are some zeros, like for some states or for some years in terms of patents, and then instead of using the logs, because then this data will drop. I mean, log 0 is basically null. So that's why I'm using the inverse hyperbolic sign transformation so that I don't also lose these observations. And so basically, if you look at the graph, you observe that there are actually no pre-trends. So even if some of them, like one of them seems a little bit significant, the F statistics suggest that they're jointly insignificant. And if you look at like the post-year part, the first, second, and third, and fourth years, it seems like there is a positive trend, but they're not distinguishable from zero. So it seems like if you call this short run, it seems like there is actually like almost no effect in the short run. But if you look at 5, 10, and 15, they represent the bins actually. So 5 represents the effect from 5 to 10, 10 represents the effect from 10 to 15, and 15 is after 15 years. So we observe that actually there is a positive and a significant increase in the number in the number of patents they have and the women have. So based on my regression results, I basically observe that providing such equal rights to women increase the number of patents obtained by women by 36% on average, and holding all else constant. Okay. So that's the main graph, and I can also show you the regression result with region by year if you would like after I'm done with the presentation. So the basic question and the basic contribution of this paper is also going to be related to the channels of innovation. So here the big question is like, okay, now we give these rights to women, and then okay, the probability of obtaining a patent by a woman increases, but what is the channel? Is it because they participate more in the labor force, or they supply, or they supply more labor, or is it the asset accumulation? They get wealthier, and then maybe their children gets more education to get more education, and then somehow the invention probability increases, and or is it the education that they get more educated, and through this, we observe higher numbers of patents obtained by women. So this is something I am working on, and this is the most challenging part of this paper, because during that time, there's happening a lot of stuff, and it's really actually hard to identify the channels. So for now, I'm just going to explain the channels based on the literature. So based on the literature, it is observed that these rights are really highly correlated in effect with the education level of women. So if you look at the asset accumulation or labor force participation rate, we do not observe a very conclusive result in the literature. And but the education does seem to react to these policies. So and after I'm done, I'm planning to get individual level data too. So I'm going to dig deeper in the channels, because it would be a really great contribution to the literature if I can identify the channels. Which I think is education, which is my hypothesis, and I will check that with the data. So additional analysis I'm working on. So basically, I'm going to include the male patents, because we also should see how the male patents change over time, because maybe in the first half of the 19th century, maybe women were not applying, but they had the idea and their husbands go and apply for the patent. Or and looking at the male patents is going to show whether it shrinks over time when the women are given these rights, so etc. So I'm planning to include male patents as well into my analysis and get information on that. And worked on too. I'm still working on to get a conclusive result. So I'm interacting the policy with literacy rate to see.
Ruveyda, Elise here. You have 2 minutes left.
Cool. I'm about to be done.
Great.
So the policy effect, I interact the policy with the literacy rate, and I observe that the policy is more effective in the areas where the literacy rate of women is higher. And third, I again interacted with the labor force participation rate, but I do not observe a significant change. A fourth issue is that maybe you might think, well, during that time, some of the states, some of them were territories. And so basically, I worked on this, and when you change the territory as a state, and when I did a robustness check, actually being a territory and turning out to be a state later on does not affect my results. The fifth, which is the most important thing, I think, is to identify the channel. And then after I identify the channel, I want to really work on a theoretical model. And in order to do all this stuff, I'm going to work on the individual level data. So for now, I want to work on a state level. If I can see that there is a positive and a significant change at the state level, then it's really worth to go in and dig deeper with the individual level data. So that's something that's in my plans too. Okay. So to conclude, by using the policy variation, I basically show that providing well-defined property rights to women increase the number of patents by women by 36% on average. And as I showed, pre-trends do not exist, and the effect is more visible in the long run. Thank you very much.
Very much, Ruveyda. This is Elise. I'm going to make one suggestion at the end here. Ruveyda, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I'm just going to suggest that you and Ezra get together over coffee in Chicago after the threat of coronavirus has passed and talk about the fact that he's working with people who are looking at the impact of Carnegie libraries on patenting behavior. And you might have things to tell each other or even to work on together.
Yeah, that would be great. Actually, my husband is also at University of Chicago, so like they probably know each other, but I don't know if he knows them. But yeah, definitely we can meet at the University of Chicago and then have some coffee and talk about it. Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. Well, I would like, we're supposed to be done now. I gather we have nearly 2 hours off now. I want to say thank you to everybody who did such a lovely job here, keeping to time and being so straightforward. And especially to Teresa for making this all work. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Elise. I was just gonna conclude also and remind everybody that while we have this super long break, which by the way happened because we were supposed to have Alessandra Buena's talk in a seminar here, which got cancelled. Then you can use this time to look at our website and look at the posters that many of our students submitted. And they would really appreciate your feedback. We also provide their contact information there. So that would be really great if you could devote some of your time to that. And also, if we didn't answer any of the questions that you had because of time constraints, I'm sure all the presenters would be happy to receive your comments via email as well.
Yeah, definitely. Please let us know if you have questions. Feedback would be great.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you all.